Hello, everyone. Welcome to Out of Character. I'm your host, the Faulty GM, and I know it's been a while, but today is going to be the second part of my Divine series. Now, the reason that it's been a long time is because my schedule has kind of gotten extremely busy with work, and my tablet broke. So I had to wait for my new tablet to get in. It got in the other day, but it's just been extremely busy. I recorded a video a few days ago and I didn't like it, so I had to record this new one. I just want you guys to know this video might be running kind of long ish, so I apologize for that. I tried to shorten it down, but there's just a lot of information that I have to get out, and I don't want to speed through the information or anything like that, so hopefully you guys are okay with that, and hopefully the information is good enough that it warrants the amount of time that it's going to take for me to give it to you. So without further ado, today is the second part of my Divine series that is going to be about how to build your Pantheon. So yeah, let's dive straight into this. So the first thing that we have to talk about, like always, is what is a Pantheon. So let's go ahead and ground it in a definition. So in real life, a pantheon can pretty much be described as pretty much explaining the values or a reflection of the values of the given culture that worships or follows that pantheon or that deity, so on and so forth. So, for example, the Olympian gods of Greek mythology represent and reflect the values of art, beauty, and the Greek cynical interpretation of human nature. Um, and you might think, well, that's in real life, but it also plays a strong part in fictional mythologies. For example, um, Lolith is a reflection of the Drow's merciless pursuit of power. Their belief of the individual over the collective and the strong over the weak. So these reflections that the gods represent or that the pantheon as a whole represents, while you're going through the steps that I'm going to lay out, I kind of want you guys to keep this in the back of your head, that while you're creating your pantheon, while you're creating your gods, there should be some kind of link between the followers and the gods that they worship, or the pantheon as a whole. For example, peace loving halflings will not be worshiping, Lolith for any reason, because she represents something that's completely foreign to what they believe. So just kind of keep that in mind. There should always be some kind of parallel between the two. So now that we have our definition, let's dive straight in again and go into pretty much the 5 steps that I created. Now, these 5 steps are pretty much my personal process that I used to create my pantheon for my setting and plenty of other things. I've kind of just thought about what I did and tried to organize it into 5 simple steps that you guys can use too. Now, keep in mind that this is just my opinion, and I hope you guys can respect it as such. This is probably not the best way to do it or the worst way. This is just the way that I do it. So I'm sure there are plenty of other ways out there on YouTube, on the internet, of ways that you can create your pantheon. This is just my insight, my little, 2 cents that I'm throwing into the discussion. So, without further ado, let's go ahead. So, there are 5 steps. The first step is naming what the pantheon's purpose is. Then it's picking the type of pantheon that you want to use, how the pantheon works, what the gods' relationship to one another are, and how involved the gods are in your world. So going back to step number 1, what is the purpose of your game? Now, this is by far the most important question that you should ask yourself. And the reason that it's really important is because by asking yourself what the purpose of your pantheon is, it saves you a lot of time and energy that you may have otherwise spent creating a bunch of stuff that's not actually relevant to either your players or you as a GM. What I mean by that is, although it's really fun to create this expansive lore with, 100 gods and so on and so forth, if your players never actually have to talk to gods because they're dungeon delving, or if only a small bit of lore is necessary for them to do it, and even that lore isn't really important, then you don't really need to spin the legwork in creating a bunch of gods. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, creating a purpose will kind of ground you and limit everything that you need to do. So, let's say you know in your head that there are 100 gods in this pantheon, but you know the story only focuses on the god of war and the god of love. Those two are the main players in this game, in the story, and those two are the ones that the players are more than likely going to interact with. Well, then, all you have to do is focus on those two gods. Now, there is a. So, I heard this a long time ago, don't quote me on this, but there is a way for you to decide whether or not your book is a romance book or not. And you can use this kind of systematic approach to your deities as well. So, from what I remember of it, it goes like this. If your book cannot function without the romance, if the romance has to be in there, and by pulling the romance out, it is no longer a good story, like the whole story kind of falls apart, then it's a romance novel because the romance is pivotal to the story. Now, if you can pluck the romance out and the story is perfectly fine, it can go on, it's no big deal, then it is not a romance novel. It is some other kind of genre based on whatever else is happening with romance involved. Now, this is pretty much the same way you want to do your gods. You want to create your purpose and decide if the story that you're using, if the story you're trying to tell, if you pluck the pantheon out of it, pluck the gods out, can the story still stand on its own? If the answer is yes, then, refine whatever you think is necessary, but you don't really need to do a lot of legwork. I would argue that you probably don't need to do anything that's going to be in this video. Now, if you try to pluck everything out and the whole story collapses on itself, then you should try to refine what you need to refine in order to progress. Now, the last thing I want to say about the purpose and why the purpose is extremely powerful and strong is because once you have the fundamentals of the purpose down, you no longer have to do the rest of it. Every other question becomes really easy to answer. It's very straightforward. You know exactly what you need to do and exactly what is too much. If the god of love and war are very important, then obviously the god of life, death, beauty, and all that other stuff is not important. So you don't have to focus on those gods. So yeah, the last thing I want to say about the purpose is that when you're writing your purpose, I heard this from Barker the other day. Try to limit it to one sentence. Explain the purpose of your entire pantheon in one sentence, and let that be your guide. So, for example, the sentence that I would try to put together is, the purpose of my gods are that the gods are having war in their realm, and the war is affecting things in our realm, which is causing all kinds of unnatural phenomenons. Avatars are taking over things, and followers of different gods are waging war on one another to give their gods the upper hand. It's a pretty long sentence, but that would be the purpose, and that would be what I'm going to be focusing on. So, let's go on to step 2. So step 2 is, what type of pantheon are your deities organized in? Now, for this section, or for this step, I'm going to be focusing on 4 different pantheons. Now, there are more pantheons, there are more types of religions out there than I could probably put in a video. So feel free to go out on your own and check them out. But the 4 that I'm using are the ones that I found to be very interesting and parallel to one another. So the first one, or the first 2, I guess, are very close together. They're called the loose pantheon and the tight pantheon. Now, the loose pantheon is when there are a bunch of gods that are very similar to one another. However, they don't, they're not organized by any kind of doctrine or order. They operate by themselves and do whatever they kind of want to do in some kind of chaotic fashion. So the gods of the Forgotten Realms are a really good example of that, since there's so many of them, and you can pretty much worship whoever you want. Now, another word for this is henotheistic. Henotheistic is the belief in one god, but the acceptance of all other gods. So you acknowledge that there is one god that you worship personally, but that there are many of that everybody else's religion exists, that you believe in those gods as well, but you pray to one god. So the Drow are actually henotheistic because they believe in Lolith, but they also believe in all the other gods. They don't believe that the other gods are false gods. They believe that they are real, but they choose to follow Lolith. Just information for random nonsense. So a tight pantheon is a little bit different. Typically, it's a lot smaller than a loose pantheon as far as the number of gods that exist. But a tight pantheon is pretty much a bunch of gods that are held together by some kind of doctrine. They're held together by order, hierarchy. There's typically an order to how things work out with them. And they are all kind of held together by some kind of belief system, so on and so forth. So those are the first two. The third one is monotheism, or monotheistic, or however you want to call it. Monotheism is pretty much the belief in one god, and that all other gods or religions are false gods, meaning that all other gods are not real gods. It would be as if the Drow only worship Lolith and believe that every other god is a false god. Now, monotheism in modern times, Christianity, Muslim, Judaism are three of the most popular religions with a lot of followers. In 2010, I believe, there was a survey that said that Christianity had 2.9 billion followers, second literally to Muslim, meaning that in current day, monotheism is pretty much the religion of the hour. So when you think about urban fantasy, it might be a very good idea for you to kind of condense a lot of these fantastical religions down to a monotheistic religion if you want to keep it very familiar. Also, I personally believe that science fiction and things like that, if you want to go further out, I think monotheism, if you want to have some kind of religious order in there, fits very, very well. Because it's very familiar. Most of us deal with Christianity or Muslim of some sort. So to think that if some religion were going to exist, it would be that. So yeah, those monotheism, and the last one is animism. I hope I said that right. I always feel like I say things wrong, but animism is pretty much the belief in spirits and the belief that spirits inhabit all things, period. They inhabit rocks, they inhabit water, they inhabit umbrellas, they inhabit lamps. They inhabit everything. Now, the reason I kind of really like animism is because animism can either be like a loose pantheon or like a tight pantheon, in the sense that they can be ordered. They can all be held together by the same belief or some kind of doctrine. There can be a king spirit with all the follower spirits, or they can be they can be similar to a loose pantheon where they're just kind of unordered, chaotic. They just do whatever they feel they need to do. Some of them can be extremely powerful, where others can be extremely weak. So animism is kind of a funny thing that you can play around with a lot. The real difference between animism and a loose and tight pantheon is that animism is kind of earthbound. Some people can argue that there could be a spirit realm, but most of the time they permeate objects. So they permeate trees, they permeate rocks and things like that. They exist inside your house, and you pay respect to them lest they, point their wrath onto you. So yeah, so for the example that I gave earlier, to kind of bring this all together, what I would say is, from my previous example, I would probably choose some type of loose pantheon to show that all the gods are not really ordered and they're fighting one another, maybe to put themselves into order. So maybe they're trying to form a tight pantheon out of the loose pantheon, killing off, deities, and maybe after the war is over, there might be a tight pantheon. You could argue that animism would work really well. However, I want the gods to be in another realm, and that realm's war affects this realm. Therefore, animism doesn't really work that well. But that's a really good way to show you that your purpose can guide you while you're doing the rest of these steps. So I'll try to keep this example going while I'm doing the rest of this. Now, step 3 is about the relationship between the gods. Now, what I mean by the relationship between the gods is not every single individual god. I mean the relationship between groups of gods. So, what you would want to do for this step is you want to kind of divide your gods into different categories. So, for example, you can separate them by element. You could separate them by the hierarchy. You could separate them by power. You could separate them by belief. You can separate them by whatever you want, despite the type of pantheon that you're going with. For example, a loose pantheon can still be separated into power levels: a greater gods, lesser gods, the creator gods, the council of the gods, so on and so forth. You can separate them into whatever you want to separate them into that fits your story and fits the flavor of your world. Now, what you want to do after that is for each section that you've kind of separated these guys into, you want to kind of write a sentence that describes the relationship between one group of gods to the other group of gods. What I mean by that is you want, so it would be like in our world, if you were trying to describe the relationship between the president and Congress, and the relationship between college, the Congress, sorry, and the uh, the judicial branch, and you want to kind of just keep going. So you would go, what is the relationship then between the president and the judicial branch? What is the relationship, and just keep going until you have all of them covered, which I think I just did. So do that for all of your categories until you have a pretty good understanding of all of them. And again, you only need to do about a sentence describing their relationship. There could be, maybe the greater gods really hate like the ruling gods, and the ruling gods kind of hate the greater gods and extent, so on and so forth. Just try to keep the relationship up. So an example of this is, typically when I do my gods, I have about 4 different groupings. I have the god who created everything, the first god, so the elder gods, which typically act as like a police force or the ruling gods of the actual gods themselves. Then you have the greater gods, the gods who typically do the most stuff or have the most power. They're kind of like the younger gods. And then the lesser gods, so the children of the greater gods. Now, what this normally looks like is the elder gods act as somewhat of a council that decides matters that involve all of the gods. The greater gods act as the ruling gods of mortals. They are the ones that are pretty much interested in mortal affairs, and the lesser gods are the ones that help the greater gods do whatever it is they normally do. So if there's a greater god of the ocean, right, of tempest, then you have lesser gods that are, the god of the western sea, the god of the northern wind, the god of, storms, and so on and so forth. And all these different aspects of these gods all serve the god of tempest, who rules over all the winds, over all the oceans, over all the creatures of the sea, so on and so forth. Now, the relationship between these gods would be like, the greater gods. So starting with the top, the creator god doesn't really have a relationship with anybody except for the elder gods, and the elder gods have a very very heavy respect for the creator god. The creator god has a very like fatherly relationship with all of them. They all respect him as like either the grandfather or the father. The elder gods have a very iffy relationship with the greater gods, simply because they're the old folks. They're the people that try to maintain tradition and order. They tend to be less emotional in my worlds. They don't show any kind of emotions. The greater gods are the ones that are very emotional and very ambitious. They're always trying to further their own agendas and gain more power. Some of them want to overthrow the creator god, some of them want to overthrow the elder god, some of them want to overthrow each other. So typically the greater gods are always at war with one another, let alone all the other gods. And the lesser gods are just trying not to get killed by anyone. So they have they have a lot of respect for most people enough that they won't get killed, while also trying to get themselves enough grace to hopefully become greater gods themselves. So the greater gods and the lesser gods are typically the most ambitious of the bunch, and that typically gives them, a lot of hatred towards one another, hatred towards everybody else, so on and so forth. So that would be an example of how I try to, create relationships between the gods. I hope these examples are helping. So the step 4 is, this is pretty much the big question, which is, how does your Pantheon work? Now, I know that sounds like a really intimidating question, but hopefully I can help you guys out in trying to make it not as intimidating and you won't need as much hard work to get through this question. So what it is you want to ask yourself 3 questions and answer those 3 questions. Now, those 3 questions are the questions that the players or your story needs to know. They are either questions that are pivotal to the story, meaning that everyone either is going to find out or needs to know in order for the plot to continue. They are things that are just common knowledge, things that everybody pretty much already knows, or it's something that the players are constantly going to come up against, are constantly going to have to deal with. So, here is a list of a few questions that should help you out. So, do they die? Do they need worshippers for power, immortality, or both? Were the gods the creators of everything, or were they created afterwards? Meaning, did all of reality come into existence and then the gods did? And if so, were they formed from mortal beliefs? Are the rules that What are the rules that the gods follow? For example, can they not lie? Can they not actually kill anyone who doesn't follow them? So on and so forth. How powerful are the gods? Can a given god only act on their aspect? For example, a goddess of the forest cannot actually control anything that is beyond the forest, but within the forest she can do whatever she wants. Do the gods have emotions? Can they feel things, or do they not have any kind of comprehension of emotions at all? Now, again, you only want to do 3 of these. So the example that I would give you for the example that I've been working on so far is that the one thing that everybody needs to know is, how influential are the followers of these gods? Now, if the gods are at war and the followers are at war, how influential are they? Is it just a small thing going on somewhere, or does this affect the entire world? How powerful are the avatars of the gods? Are they akin to gods themselves? If the players are actually going to end up fighting one of these guys, if I want one of these avatars to be the bad guy, I kind of need to think about how powerful these guys are going to be. And 3, what are benefits to joining up with a god? Would most of the characters be religious? Is this some kind of like religious world? And if so, what are the benefits of being a part of each, god? Do gods give benefits in order to increase their following? So these are 3 questions that are extremely important, and 3 questions that I think the players would constantly come up against. So I should figure those out before we start playing, and then move on. And then boom, that's how my gods work. If any other questions come up, I'll just answer them while it comes up, or it's just not really that important. So to me, that's simple enough. But I understand that some people want to do more, and if you want to do more, then just keep asking questions and keep answering them until you feel you've answered everything that the players need to know or that the story needs to know. So, how active are the gods in your world? That is step number 5. So this is probably the easiest one, and this one is pretty much broken down in 3 parts. Are they slightly involved, very involved, or just not involved at all? If they are not involved at all, that means that they are pretty much rarely involved in mortal affairs. They act very indirectly. They're very vague and abstract. It's very hard to tell when a god does something for you, if it was a blessing, a miracle, or if it was just a coincidence. So when gods are slightly involved, they act more indirectly, and they rarely act directly, meaning that they do sometimes act directly upon things, and they do sometimes reveal themselves, but it's very rare and far between. So, for example, in a world with clerics, only clerics and paladins ever actually interact with the gods. Most other people have never seen a god before, have never talked to a god before, and they only know that the gods are real through clerics and paladins. Um, so they kind of involve themselves in mortal affairs, but only mortal affairs that really uh, need their involvement. So when the gods are actively involved, just very, very involved, they care a lot about the mortal affairs. Mortal affairs have a very big bearing on their agendas. The gods are always pushing their agendas on the mortals. Gods are often acting very directly. Most people have, seen gods move in not mysterious or vague ways, very direct, very precise ways. And sometimes the gods also act in very indirect ways as well. But it's never vague. It's never mysterious. It's always, yeah, that was that god. So, yeah, for the example that I've been kind of pushing here, I would say that the gods are between slightly and very active, because yes, the gods do. I'd actually say active. I'd say the gods are very active. It's very hard to dismiss them. It's very hard to not acknowledge them. And when they have time away from their war, they probably do directly act and try to, keep track of what's going on down here. So I know that this is a really long video. I really apologize for that. I tried to do a really short video. I tried to cut out all the examples, but I felt like I wanted to get in as much information as I could and try to tell you guys without shortchanging you. So I hope it was worth it. I hope you guys liked it. Let me know what you guys think. Also, there are some worksheets to follow along with this video at the down below in the comment section. So check those out. There's also an example of Sunder down there and how I use this to create Sunder, or the gods for Sunder. So yeah, check that out, guys. Let me know what you think, and yeah, have a good day.